Tonight, we will return to the battlefield with stories that most other units would prefer to bury. This is a time to relax, unwind, slowly listen, and feel the weight of a history that was never meant to be recorded in official after-action reports. We are stepping back into the winter of 1942, to a place where the geography of the world was reduced to a few square miles of pulverized brick, twisted rebar, and frozen blood. We are going to Stalingrad. By late November, the German Sixth Army found itself not just fighting a Soviet adversary, but battling a city that seemed to have developed a consciousness of its own, a sentient, hungry landscape that swallowed divisions whole. You are a soldier stationed in the ruins of the industrial district, perhaps near the skeletal remains of the Red October factory or the barricade. The environment is a masterclass in psychological erosion. The air doesn't oppose. Just feel cold. It feels sharp, like microscopic shards of glass entering your lungs with every shallow breath. The temperature has dropped so low that the oil in your Mauser has thickened into a useless paste, and the steel of your helmet feels like it oppose. Trying to fuse with your skull. Everything is gray, white, and black. There is no color left in this world, only the varying shades of soot and snow. You sit in what used to be a kitchen on the third floor of an apartment block that has been halved by a 500-kilogram bomb. From your vantage point, you can see the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. It is a conflict fought room by room, cellar by cellar, where the front line is often a single interior wall. The smell is the first thing that breaks a man, a sickening cocktail of brick dust, cordite, and the sweet heavy scent of frozen corpses that the snow hasn't oppose. Quite managed to bury. It's a smell that clings to your wool tunic, a permanent reminder that you are living in a tomb. The veterans, the ones who survived the initial push to the Volga, Don and Oppos, talk about the tactical situation or the lack of supply drops.
They talk about the echo, bong macea engenat, echo, the ghosts of the Ruble.
There is a localized folklore that has emerged among the forward units, a shared hallucination born from exhaustion, hunger, and the sheer impossibility of the situation. They whisper about a figure that doesn't oppose. Belonged to the Red Army or the Wehrmacht. They call her, the woman in black, In a city where every living thing is covered in the dust of war, she is said to wear garments of pure, deep mourning black, an impossible color in this monochromatic hell. You maintain a strict perimeter, but perimeter, is a loose term when the enemy could be in the basement directly beneath you or the rafters above.
The silence in Stalingrad is never truly empty.
It is a pressurized quiet, punctuated by the rhythmic crunch crunch of snow under boots that you hope are German, and the distant haunting howl of the wind as it whips through the hollowed-out window frames of the city. Sometimes, the wind sounds like a human voice, a low melodic lament that seems to rise from the very stones. Your squad is down to 5 men. You are tired, your eyes are sunken into your head, and your peripheral vision has started to play tricks on you. You see flickers of movement in the shadows of the gutted buildings, shapes that move too fast to be human and too large to be the starving dogs that roam the ruins. You check your ammunition count, the brass casings cold and precious in your gloved hands. Every round must count. Out here, there is no room for error. And yet, the more alert you become, the more the reality of the city begins to warp.
You look out over the wasteland towards the Volga.
The moon is a pale, sickly disk obscured by the smoke of constant fires. It casts long, distorted shadows across the mounds of debris, shadows that seem to detach themselves from the ruins and linger in the open spaces. It is in this landscape of jagged edges and frozen despair that you first hear the story from a sniper who was pulled back from the tennis racket sector. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from a profound existential dread. He spoke of a figure standing atop a heap of pulverized concrete and iron, a silhouette that ignored the incoming mortar fire and the whistling of sniper rounds. A woman in a black veil, her back to the Volga, her hand outstretched, pointing a single gloved finger into the heart of the ruins. He said that those who followed her direction were led into a blind spot, in the Soviet defenses, a path that seemed clear, a shortcut through the rubble. But every man who took that path vanished. No radio chatter, no bodies recovered, just a sudden, absolute erasure from the map. You listen to these stories and you tell yourself it is the stress of the siege. You are a professional, a soldier of the Sixth Army, trained in the logic of modern warfare. You tell yourself that the mind, when pushed to the brink of starvation and madness, creates monsters to explain the inexplicable. But as you sit on fire watch, watching the frost crawl across the masonry, you realize that the normal rules of engagement have been suspended. The city isn't and oppose, just a battlefield anymore, it's a site of ritualistic suffering. The snow begins to fall again, large heavy flakes that mute the sounds of the distant artillery. The visibility drops to 20 yards. You are alone in your kitchen-turned bunker, your rifle resting against a shattered stove. The wind picks up, and for a moment, the smoke clears from a nearby ruin, a former department store that looks like a blackened ribcage against the sky. There, on the very edge of a collapsed floor, 50 feet above the ground, you see a smudge of darkness. It is a solid, unmoving shape that shouldn't oppose, be there. It isn't oppose, the gray of a Soviet greatcoat or the camouflage of a German sniper. It is a deep, obsidian black that seems to absorb the little light left in the world. You reach for your binoculars, your breath catching in your throat as the lenses fog up. You wipe them frantically, your heart hammering against your ribs. When you look again, the figure is clearer. It is a woman. She is dressed in the traditional weeds of a widow, her veil fluttering in the sub-zero wind like a dying bird. She isn't oppose, looking at the battle. She is looking at you. And then, slowly, she raises her arm. Her finger points toward the dark, gaping mouth of a subway tunnel a block away, a route your commander had suggested for the morning and oppo's flanking maneuver. The dread that washes over you is unlike any fear of combat. It is a cold, hollow realization that you are being invited to your own funeral. The woman in black hasn't oppose, said a word, but the message is written in the very air, this way to the end. The rumors did not spread like campfire stories. They spread like a contagion through the ranks of the Sixth Army, whispered in the humid, stinking darkness of basement bunkers, and recorded in the frantic shorthand notes of field chaplains. By the second week of December, the woman in black was no longer just a shadow you saw in the corner of your eye. She had become a tactical reality, a ghost that occupied the high ground of every ruined sector from the Mamiev Kurgan to the Volga docks. You sit in your designated sector, a hollowed-out bakery where the scent of burnt flour still lingers beneath the stench of decay, listening to your squad leader, a man named Corporal Steiner, recount what he saw during the midnight patrol near the grain elevator. Steiner is a man of iron, a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns who views the world through the cold lens of a Zeiss optic, yet his hands are trembling as he tries to roll a cigarette with dry, brittle tobacco. He tells the unit that while observing a Soviet machine gun nest through his periscope, the air suddenly turned thin and not just cold but devoid of all sound, as if the war itself had been placed on mute. He saw her then, standing atop a precariously balanced slab of concrete 3 stories up. She was a pillar of absolute darkness, her black mourning veil unmoving despite the gale-force winds whipping across the frozen river. Steiner watched as she slowly raised a gloved hand and pointed toward a narrow alleyway that led to a collapsed cellar, a path the lieutenant had designated as our primary exit route for the dawn withdrawal. I didn't oppose, like the look of it, Steiner whispers, his voice barely audible over the rattling of a loose corrugated iron sheet nearby. There was a weight to that finger, a gravity that felt like it was pulling my very soul toward that alley. But I remembered what the scouts from the 24th Panzer Division said. I turned my head. I looked back at the grain elevator, back the way we came, and I ordered the patrol to double back through the open ruins, right through the Soviet sniper lanes. The squad sits in silence, the flickering light of Hindenburg light a small tallow candle, casting their shadows against the soot-blackened walls. You know the rest of the story before Steiner even finishes it. The patrol that took the alleyway, a unit from a neighboring company led by a headstrong sergeant who laughed at superstitious nonsense was never heard from again. They weren't and oppose, just killed, they vanished. No radio chatter, no screams, no sound of a struggle. When a recovery team finally braved the alleyway 24 hours later, they found nothing but pristine, undisturbed snow. No footprints, no blood, and most terrifyingly, no signs that a squad of 10 men had ever entered the space. This is the pattern of the Stalingrad widow. She does not attack, she does not scream, she simply indicates. She is a silent director of the dead. You realize that the geography of the city is being rewritten by her presence. The safe routes on your maps are becoming death traps, and the suicidal paths are becoming the only way to survive another night in the Kessel. The military hierarchy, however, remains stubbornly blind. Your lieutenant, a man named von Berg, is an aristocrat who believes in maps, logistics, and the inevitable victory of German steel. To him the reports of a woman in black are symptoms of Kessel fever a mass psychological breakdown caused by the lack of calories and the constant vibration of the Soviet Stalin's organs rocket launchers. We move at 04:00, von Berg announces, stepping into the bakery with the crisp artificial confidence of someone who hasn't an yet accepted that he is trapped in a grave. He points to the grid coordinates on the map, his finger tracing the exact route the figure had pointed out to you the night before, the subway tunnel. The intelligence reports suggest the tunnels are clear of Bolshevik elements. We will use them to bypass the barricades and strike at the enemy and Oppo's rear. You look at Steiner. You see the same realization in his eyes that is currently chilling your own blood. The order is a death sentence, signed not by the Red Army, but by the entity standing on the ruins. You try to speak, to mention the omen, but the words die in your throat. How do you tell an officer that the ruins are talking? How do you explain that a silhouette in a black veil knows more about the tactical situation than the high command? As the unit prepares to move, the psychological atmosphere becomes unbearable. The silence of the bakery is replaced by a low-frequency hum, a vibration that feels like it's coming from deep beneath the frozen earth. You check your gear one last time. Your gas mask, your grenades, your spare magazines, they all feel like useless lead weights. You look out of the shattered window, hoping to see nothing, hoping the night is just a night. But she is there. She is standing on a burnt-out Panzer III in the middle of the street, barely 10 yards away. In the dim moonlight, you can see the texture of her black dress. It isn't and Oppo's wool or silk, it looks like woven smoke. She doesn't and Oppo's have a face, or if she does, it is hidden behind a veil so thick that no light can penetrate it. She stands perfectly still as the wind howls around her, a motionless void in a world of chaos. And then, with an agonizing slowness, she raises her hand. She doesn't and Oppo's point at the subway tunnel this time. She points directly at you. Then her hand shifts slightly, her finger indicating a jagged hole in a nearby wall, a path that leads away from a lieutenant's objective, back toward the death zone of the open square where the Soviet snipers wait. Unit forward. Von Berg commands, his boots crunching on the glass and snow as he leads the squad toward the subway entrance. You stand at the threshold between the lieutenant's command and the widow's direction. To follow the officer is to follow the rules of the world that brought you here. To follow the finger is to trust the monster that haunts your nightmares. You see Steiner hesitate. He looks at the tunnel, then at the hole in the wall, then back at the woman in black. He makes his choice. He turns his back on the lieutenant and crawls toward the jagged hole in the wall, gesturing for you to follow. The rest of the squad follows von Berg into the dark, echoing maw of the subway. As the last of their shadows disappears into the earth, the woman in black lowers her hand. She turns her head toward you, and for a fraction of a second, the veil flutters. You don and Oppo's see a face. You see the vast empty expanse of the Russian winter, a frozen eternity that is waiting to claim every name on the roster. You dive into the hole after Steiner, the sound of your own heartbeat the only thing keeping you from drifting away into the gray. Behind you from the subway tunnel, there is a sudden sharp silence, A silence that screams louder than any explosion. The subway tunnel did not swallow von Berg and the others with a bang, but with a sudden suffocating absence of sound that felt like a physical blow. You and Steiner crouched in the jagged hole of the masonry, your breathing ragged and white in the sub-zero air, waiting for the sound of a grenade or the rhythmic rattle of a Soviet PPSH-41. It never came. There was only the wind, howling through the hollowed-out ribs of Stalingrad like a wounded animal. You looked back toward the street where the Panzer III sat rusted and frozen, but the woman in black was gone. The obsidian void she occupied had been replaced by the flat, dead gray of the Russian morning. Steiner didn't speak. He simply gripped his Kar 98K and gestured for you to keep moving through the ruins of the dead zone, a stretch of open rubble where the 6th Army's maps were marked with red crosses. As you navigated the twisted iron and pulverized brick, Steiner began to explain the curse of the pointing finger in the low, dry tone of a man delivering a casualty report. He spoke of an Obergefreiter from the 297th Infantry, who had encountered her near the central station. The woman had stood atop a pile of frozen corpses and pointed toward a pristine, undamaged pharmacy. The Obergefreiter, driven by a desperate need for medical supplies, led his squad inside. Within 24 hours, the pharmacy was hit by a stray screaming Mimi rocket, but the shells didn't just kill them. The building collapsed in a way that sealed the cellar perfectly. When the rescue teams dug them out, they found the men had not died from a blast or suffocation. They were found sitting in a circle, their eyes wide and their fingers all pointing toward the center of the room, where nothing existed but the cold, stagnant air. She is the Toda Sanzage, the death notice, Steiner whispered, his eyes never leaving the ridgeline of a collapsed department store. She doesn't lead you to the enemy. She leads you to the end. Her finger is a vector of fate. If she points away, that way is already written in the book of the dead. You felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter. The logic of the military, of grid coordinates, flanking maneuvers and fire support, was being replaced by a predatory folklore that lived in the very mortar of the city. Steiner explained that the veterans had learned a singular terrifying rule: never follow the finger. If she indicates a path, you must turn back, even if it means walking directly into the teeth of a Russian machine gun nest. The dead zone was an environment of total sensory deprivation. The Swangmu fog was thick with the scent of old smoke and the metallic tang of frozen blood. Every few yards, you passed the remains of soldiers, both German and Soviet, frozen in positions of eternal struggle, their bodies preserved by the ice like macabre statues. Steiner led you toward a partially collapsed cellar where a group of Highwis Russian volunteers were huddled around a small smokeless stove. They looked at you with eyes that had seen the world burn and found it wanting. One of them, an old man with a face like cracked leather, crossed himself when Steiner mentioned the woman in black. The Lady of Sorrows, the old man muttered in a dialect of German that was half Russian. She was here long before the tanks. She is the mother of the Volga's grief. When the blood of thousands enters the soil, she rises to show the way to the silence. He explained that she was not a ghost of a single person, but a manifestation of the city's collective agony, a folklore entity that the locals had feared for centuries, now fed by the industrial-scale slaughter of 1942. He warned that her pointing was not a choice, but a mirror. She pointed to the direction where a man's fear would most likely lead him to his own doom. The tension in the cellar escalated as the rhythmic thud of distant heavy artillery began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of combat. It was the sound of a city being systematically dismantled. Steiner checked his watch. The hands were moving, but the ticking sounded like the crunch of boots on snow. He looked at you, his professional veneer cracking for the first time. Von Berg followed her direction, he said, his voice a dry rasp. He thought he was being clever, using the tunnels to bypass the front. But the tunnels are where the city breathes, You realized then that the curse, was a form of psychological entrapment. The woman in black appeared precisely when a man was at his most desperate, offering a way out that was actually an exit from reality itself. As you sat there, the shadows on the cellar walls began to shift. The flickering light from the stove cast a long silhouette that looked remarkably like a woman in a veil. You watched, paralyzed, as the shadow hand on the wall slowly detached itself from the body and began to point toward the heavy iron door of the cellar, the only way out to the surface. Steiner saw it too. He didn't oppose, scream. He simply stood up and backed away from the door, his rifle held loosely in his hand. She's here, he breathed. The highwist began to wail, a low melodic sound that matched the howling of the wind outside. The air in the cellar turned impossibly cold, and the smell of the bakery, the burnt flour and decay, returned with a sickening intensity. You felt the weight of the pointing pressing against your chest, a physical force urging you to open that door and step out into the white. But you remembered Steiner's warning, turn back. You grabbed Steiner's arm and pointed toward a narrow, debris-choked ventilation shaft in the back of the room, a route that looked impossible to navigate and led further into the dark heart of the ruins. It was the opposite of the clear path the shadow was indicating. Steiner nodded, his face a mask of grim determination. As you scrambled into the tight, cold space of the shaft, you looked back one last time. The iron door of the cellar was swinging open, though no one was there to push it. Outside, in the swirling swung moo of the Stalingrad morning, the woman in black stood perfectly still. She was no longer pointing at the street. She was pointing directly into the cellar, her finger a dark needle that seemed to sew the room shut. The highwist cries were cut short, not by a gunshot, but by a silence so sudden it felt like a vacuum. You turned and crawled into the dark, your shadow trailing behind you like a frayed rope, praying that by choosing the impossible path, you had cheated the widow of one more name. The ventilation shaft was a narrow, ice-slicked throat of rusted tin and calcified soot, a passage that forced you to crawl on your stomach while the weight of the ruined city pressed down on your spine. Steiner moved ahead of you, his boots occasionally kicking back small sprays of grit that tasted like ancient limestone and metallic rust. We emerged not into another street, but into the hollowed-out guts of what the maps called Pavlov's grain elevator, the giant of the Volga. It was a massive vertical labyrinth of concrete silos and conveyor belts, a landscape of echoes where the wind sang through bullet holes like a choir of the damned. The air here was even colder than the streets, a stagnant, biting frost that seemed to have been trapped since the first day of the siege.
In the shadow of a massive grain-hopper, we found Private Gunther.
He was a sniper from the 3rd Battalion, a man who had lived in the vertical world of the elevators for 3 weeks, hunting anything that moved on the docks below. He was hunched in a nest made of discarded sandbags and frozen flour sacks, his Kar 98K with its ZF-42 optic resting on a concrete lip. But Gunter wasn't oppose, looking through his scope. He was staring at the floor, his face the color of the gray ash that drifted through the window frames. His hands, wrapped in strips of dirty wool, were locked in a death grip around his rifle. She's been here, Gunter whispered, his voice cracking. He didn't look up at us. He just pointed a trembling finger toward the upper catwalks, a dizzying height of rusted iron bars that vanished into the darkness of the ceiling. She stood right where I usually take my shots. She didn't oppose, make a sound.
Nos boots sont the métal, nos rostel of fabrique. Just, all in the dark point echo.
Steiner knelt beside him, his face grim. Did she point, Gunter? Gunter nodded slowly. She pointed toward the ferry crossing. A clear shot. I could have taken out an entire Soviet command staff. It was the perfect position, a sniper's dream. But I looked at her veil. The wind was blowing at 20 knots through this tower, but her black dress, it stayed perfectly still. It was like she was painted onto the air.
I remember the stories from the Rattenkrieg.
I refused to move to the spot. You looked up at the catwalks. The Swangmu had followed us into the elevator, coiling around the rusted pillars like pale, translucent snakes. The environment felt artificial, as if the laws of physics were being held together by a fraying thread. The grain elevator was a cathedral of industrial death, and we were the uninvited guests. Gunter explained that after he refused to move to the spot she indicated, the woman didn't oppose to leave. She simply walked to the edge of the catwalk and stood there, looking down at him. She didn't oppose to have to say anything. The weight of her gaze was enough to make his skin crawl. End quote. I looked through my scope at her, end quote. Gunter continued, his eyes wide with the memory. End quote. I wanted to see her face. I wanted to see if she was a Russian partisan in a costume or just a trick of the light. I dialed the focus to 80 yards. I saw the lace of her veil. It was beautiful, intricate, and then I realized I was looking through it. There was no face behind the black mesh. Just a swirling vortex of the same gray swangmu that covers the river. I dropped the rifle, and when I looked back without the lens, she was gone. End quote. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic thump-thump of Soviet mortars hitting the outskirts of the sector. Steiner checked the perimeter. We were trapped in a vertical cage. The end quote, Lady of Sorrows end quote, wasn't oppose, just directing us toward death traps. She was isolating us. Every path she pointed to was a shortcut to a grave, but by refusing her, we were forced into the most dangerous, unstable parts of the ruins. The grain elevator was a maze of crumbling concrete and sheer drops. One wrong step in the dark meant a 50-foot fall into a grain silo filled with the frozen dead. Then, the sound started. It wasn't oppose, the sound of boots. It was a low melodic humming, a mournful lullaby that seemed to vibrate from the very rebar in the walls. It was a woman's voice, singing in a language that sounded like a mix of German, Russian, and something much older, a tongue of the earth itself. The humming was coming from the catwalks above. End quote, Don and oppose, look up end quote, Steiner commanded, his voice a sharp military snap. End quote, keep your eyes on the grid coordinates of the exit. We move out through the loading chutes. End quote. But curiosity is a soldier and oppose's greatest enemy when faced with the supernatural. You couldn't oppose help it.
You tilted your head back. In the dim, filtered light of the moon, you saw her.
The woman in black was standing on the highest rail, her silhouette a jagged cut of obsidian against the gray sky. She was looking down at the three of you. She didn't oppose look like a ghost. She looked like an inevitability. Slowly, with the grace of a falling leaf, she raised her hand. She didn't oppose point toward the ferry crossing this time. She pointed toward Gunter. Then her hand shifted, indicating the very sandbag nest where he was sitting. Gunter let out a choked sob. He scrambled backward, away from his rifle, away from the spot the widow was marking. But as he moved, the floor beneath him, a section of concrete weakened by weeks of shelling, gave way with a sickening crack. The sound was deafening in the hollow tower. Gunter didn't oppose have time to scream. He slid into the dark maw of a grain silo, his fingers clawing uselessly at the smooth concrete as he vanished into the blackness. A second later, there was no sound of a body hitting the bottom.
No tude, no groan.
Just the return of that oppressive silence. End quote, Gunter. End quote, you shouted, crawling toward the edge of the hole. Steiner grabbed your collar and pulled you back with a strength born of pure panic. End quote, he's gone end quote, Steiner hissed. End quote, look at the rail. End quote. The woman in black was no longer on the catwalk. She was standing on the edge of the broken floor, right where Gunter had been a second ago. She wasn't oppose pointing anymore. She was looking down into the silo, her veil fluttering slightly as if caught in a draft from the void below. She had marked the spot, and the city had complied. The ruins were her instrument, and we were the notes she was playing. We fled.
We did ne appos, eu the chute. We scrambled down a rusted service lade, or en burning from the cold metal.
We didn't oppose look back. We burst out into the frozen air of the docks, the Swangmu swallowing the grain elevator behind us until the massive structure looked like a ghost ship in a sea of white. We were down to 2 men now.
Steiner and you.
The roster of the 6th Army was getting shorter with every hour, and the widow was still checking names off her list. You looked at Steiner's shadow as you ran. It was long and thin, stretching across the snow. For a moment, it looked like his shadow was reaching back toward the elevator, as if it didn't oppose. Want to leave the woman in black. The folklore was right, she didn't oppose, just point to your death. She claimed the space where you stood. Every step we took was a gamble against a city that was no longer made of stone, but of sorrow. We reached the wreckage of a municipal library, a skeletal structure of charred timber and frozen paper, situated just a few hundred yards from the Volga's edge. The docks were a graveyard of sunken barges and twisted cranes, but the library offered a temporary sanctuary of shadows. Steiner and you collapsed into a corner behind a fallen marble pillar, your lungs burning with the effort of breathing air that felt like liquid nitrogen. The Swangmu followed us in, a slow-moving tide of white vapor that curled around the ruined bookshelves as if searching for a specific volume. You sat in the darkness, the only sound being the metallic clink-clink of your cooling rifle and the rhythmic, labored gasps of your own breath. Then, the shelling stopped. In Stalingrad, a pause in the Soviet artillery was usually a cause for celebration, a brief window to move supplies or drag the wounded into the cellars. But this silence was different. It wasn't a cessation of hostilities, it was an extraction of sound. One moment, the world was a cacophony of whistling katyushas and the distant heavy thud of 152mm howitzers. The next, it was as if a heavy velvet curtain had been dropped over the entire city. The silence was pressurized, pushing against your eardrums until they ached. It was the silence of the widow, the veterans called it. It was the moment when the war of man ended and the war of the city began. Don and oppose, look at the gaps in the walls, Steiner whispered, his voice so low it was almost a vibration. He was staring at his hands, his fingers interlaced to hide the tremors. The Swangmu is looking for eyes. If you meet her gaze through a crack in the masonry, you belong to the direction she points.
Keep your eyes on the floor.
Count the bricks.
Focus on the reality of the clé point echo.
You tried to follow his advice, but the feeling of being watched was a physical weight on the back of your neck. It wasn't the sharp predatory stare of a Soviet sniper. It was a cold morning gaze that felt like it was originating from every shadow at once. You felt as though the ruins themselves were becoming a single giant eye. The environment of the library, once a place of knowledge and culture, had been stripped of its purpose. Now it was just a collection of jagged edges and dark corners, a perfect hunting ground for the Lady of Sorrows. The psychological erosion of the siege was reaching its peak. Your mind, starved of calories and sleep, began to interpret the frozen shapes around you as her silhouette. A blackened coat hanging from a beam became her dress. A thin trail of soot on a wall became her veil. But then you saw a movement that couldn't oppose, be explained away by trench nerves, in the center of the library, where a grand staircase had once spiraled toward the upper floors, a patch of darkness was detaching itself from the shadows. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a rat. It was a vertical line of absolute black, moving with a slow gliding grace across the frost-covered floor. There was no sound of boots on the glass, no rustle of fabric against the stone. It was a void moving through the light. You felt the temperature in the room drop another 10 degrees. Your breath stopped blooming in the air. It was as if the very heat of your body was being siphoned away by the presence. Steiner, you breathed, your hand inching toward your Mauser. I know, he replied, his eyes still fixed on the floor. She's checking the roster. She's looking for the men who survived the elevator. She doesn't oppose, like it when the tally is wrong. The figure stopped 10 yards away, near a heap of burnt books. Even in the dim gray light of the Stalingrad morning, the blackness of her mourning weeds was jarring. It was a color that shewed Ndapos, to exist in nature, a depth of obsidian that absorbed the moonlight and the Swangmu alike. She stood perfectly still, her back to you, her veil flowing in a wind that you couldn't Ndapos, feel. The silence of the library became so absolute that you could hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of your own heart. It was a wet, heavy thud that sounded like a shovel hitting damp earth. Slowly, the woman in black began to turn. It was Ndapos, a human movement. It was as if the world was rotating around her. As her profile became visible, you saw the gloved hand emerge from the folds of her dress.
Yor a ta merde against your rib-like attraped bird.
You knew what was coming. You knew the curse of the pointing finger was about to be leveled at one of you. You squeezed your eyes shut, a desperate childish attempt to hide from a fate that didn't Ndapos, care about sight. Look at me, private, a voice whispered. It was Ndapos, Steiner's voice. It was Ndapos, a voice at all, really. It was a thought that had been placed inside your skull, a cold melodic vibration that tasted like copper and old snow. It sounded like your mother, but a mother who had been dead for 1,000 years. It was the voice of the city Ndapos, grief, calling you to join the choir. You opened your eyes. The woman in black was pointing. Her finger was extended, a dark needle indicating the staircase, or what was left of it. The stairs led to a jagged balcony that hung over a 50-foot drop into a flooded basement filled with the rusted machinery of the library's heating system. It was a path to nowhere. It was an invitation to a fall. Steiner finally looked up. His face was a mask of utter vacancy, his eyes reflecting the gray void of the Swangmu. He began to stand up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. He was Ndapos, looking at the woman. He was looking at the stairs. He was looking at the direction of his own end. Steiner, no. You hissed, grabbing his webbing. He didn't Ndapos, even feel your grip. He was a man already gone, a name already crossed off the list. The pointing was a gravity that he could no longer resist. But as he took his first step toward the stairs, the silence of the city was shattered. A single distant Soviet mortar round, stray that had no business being fired during the pause, whistled through the air and slammed into the library's roof. The explosion was a deafening roar of fire and falling masonry. The shockwave threw you back against the marble pillar, and the world vanished in a cloud of white dust and red sparks. It was a chaotic, violent intrusion of the real war into the supernatural ritual. For a moment, the rules of the city were broken by the random brutality of the front. When the dust settled, the woman in black was gone. The staircase had collapsed into a heap of rubble, and the path she had pointed to was now a literal hole in the world. Steiner was lying on his back, his eyes blinking as the color slowly returned to his face. He looked at the stairs, then at you, and then at his own hands. The spell of the pointing had been broken by the very thing we feared most, the war itself. The war, it saved us Steiner whispered, a hysterical edge to his voice. You looked around the ruined library. The Swangmu was retreating, and the rhythmic thud of the artillery was starting up again.
The silence was sauvaire.
But as you looked at the floor where the woman in black had stood, you saw something that made the hair on your arms stand up. In the fresh layer of dust and snow, there were no footprints. But there was a single long black thread, a piece of lace from a mourning veil, snagged on a splinter of marble. It was a physical receipt for a debt that had only been deferred. We didn't Ndapos, stay to celebrate. We crawled out of the library and back into the gray landscape of the docks, two men who were now living on borrowed time. The city was still watching. The widow was still waiting. And the roster was still open. We left the library behind, moving like ghosts through the skeletal remains of the city. Every step in the frozen slush felt like a betrayal of the earth, our boots crunching on glass and bone in a rhythmic, agonizing cadence. We eventually reached a regimental command post, CP, situated in the reinforced basement of a former bank near the Red Square. The air inside was a stagnant mixture of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of blood from the triage station in the adjacent room. It was a place of frantic, desperate bureaucracy, where officers in stained tunics tried to command a battle that had long since devolved into a series of isolated, doomed struggles. We were looking for a way to report the loss of our unit, but the moment we stepped into the dim light of the lantern-lit hall, we realized that our story was already part of the files. On a battered wooden table cluttered with radio parts and half-empty schnapps bottles, lay a folder. It was a thick leather-bound dossier marked with a single red-inked stamp, Geheim, Secret. Next to it sat a captain of the intelligence corps, a man whose eyes were so deeply sunken they looked like bruised thumbprints in his skull. He was staring at a stack of discarded reports, his pen scratching rhythmically across a sheet of gray, low-quality paper. He didn't oppose. Look up as we approached, but he stopped writing the moment Steiner mentioned the ruins of the industrial district and the woman in black, You're the third group tonight, the captain said, his voice a dry, hollow rasp that sounded like wine through a ribcage. He pushed the folder toward us. Sit down. Drink if you have it. The report you're looking for doesn't oppose. Exist officially. High Command calls it oppose. Sector-induced mass hallucination type 42. Oppose. They want it suppressed. They want to believe that the men of the 6th Army are simply suffering from a lack of calories and too much exposure to the Soviet oppose, psyops oppose, I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of handwritten accounts, some on official military forms, others scrawled on the backs of ration cards or scrap paper. Each one told a variation of the same nightmare. A private near the barricade reported a woman in a black veil pointing toward an unexploded 500-pound bomb that detonated the moment his squad approached. A sergeant near the tractor factory described her indicating a safe basement that turned out to be a mass grave for a missing panzer unit. The reports were cold, clinical, and terrifying in their consistency. The captain gestured to a specific page, a discarded report from a field psychiatrist who had been stationed at the front for only 4 days before he was found dead of natural causes in a room with no windows and a locked door. The doctor had a theory the captain whispered. He didn't oppose. Thinks she was a ghost. He thought she was oppose, folklore echo oppose, a localized manifestation of the city's collective trauma. Stalingrad, he wrote, has seen so much suffering that the environment itself has become a recording device. The woman in black is the playback of every widow and oppose's grief since the first stone was laid on the Volga. As I read, the psychological weight of the pointing became visceral. The report described how the human brain, under extreme combat fatigue, seeks a guide in the chaos. The entity doesn't oppose, force a soldier to move, she simply offers a direction in a world where every direction is death. By pointing, she provides the illusion of choice. The soldiers who followed her finger weren't oppose, just following a ghost, they were surrendering to the inevitable gravity of the city's sorrow. Look at the last entry, the captain said, his eyes finally meeting mine. The last entry was dated only 6 hours ago. It was a report from a radio operator at Regimental HQ. He claimed that the woman in black had appeared inside the communications bunker. She didn't oppose, point at a map or a door. She pointed at the radio itself. Following her direction, the operator tuned the frequency to a deadband, a frequency that shouldn't oppose, have had any signal. He heard the voices of the 6th Army's dead. Not as screams, but as a calm rhythmic chanting of names and dates of birth. The report ended mid-sentence, the pen stroke trailing off the page into a jagged line. The boy who wrote that, the captain muttered, he's in the triage room next door. He hasn't oppose, spoken since. He just stares at the corner and points. He doesn't oppose. T point at people or things. He points at the swangmu that seeps through the cracks in the concrete. End quote. The atmosphere in the CP shifted. The frantic noise of the battle outside, the rhythmic crump of mortar shells and the chatter of machine guns, seemed to recede, replaced by that pressurized, artificial silence we had encountered in the library. I looked at Steiner. He was staring at the captain's shadow.
In the flickering light of the kerosene lamp, the shadow of the captain ascended on the wall was neapos. Te holding a pen.
It was extended, the index finger pointing toward the heavy steel door that led deeper into the sublevels of the bank, a place where the ammunition was stored, and where no one was authorized to go. The captain noticed our gaze. He looked at his own shadow and didn't oppose. T flinch. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face, a movement that looked like the cracking of dry leather. End quote. She isn and oppose. T just in the ruins anymore, end quote, he whispered. End quote. She's in the command structure. She's directing the maps now. Why do you think we keep ordering attacks on the same empty factories? Why do you think the supply drops always land in the Soviet lines? She's the one drawing the grid coordinates. End quote. Steiner stood up, his hand going to the hilt of his trench knife. End quote. We're leaving, end quote, he said, his voice sounding thin and metallic. End quote. You can't oppose. T leave a tomb, end quote, the captain replied, his voice fading into the low-frequency hum of the city. End quote. You can only choose which corner to die in. But tell me, Sergeant, did she point at you tonight?
Did she show you the way back to the Reich? Echo.
We didn't oppose. T answer. We turned and pushed through the heavy door, back into the freezing, soot-filled air of the streets. The CP was no longer a refuge, it was a catalogue of the condemned. As we walked away from the bank, the swangmu thickened, turning the ruins into a world of blurred edges and half-seen shapes. I checked my pocket for the black thread I had found in the library. It was gone. In its place was a small frozen piece of charcoal that smelled of a widow's hearth. We were no longer just soldiers of the Sixth Army. We were variables in a calculation we didn't oppose. T understand, being guided by a finger that knew exactly where the last man would fall. The city was whispering, and the only thing louder than the guns was the silence of the woman in black. The blizzard that descended upon Stalingrad that night was not a natural weather event. It was a localized erasure of the world. The swangmu fog, that had been a creeping, white tide suddenly crystallized into a vertical wall of driving snow, a Siberian gale that carried the scent of old ash and frozen iron. You and Steiner were moving along the jagged spine of a collapsed apartment block, a terrain of jagged rebar and pulverized brick that felt like the ribcage of a dying giant. The visibility was reduced to less than 3 yards. Every few steps, the wind would whip the snow into a localized vortex, creating shapes that looked like hooded figures standing just at the edge of your vision. You clung to the rough masonry, your fingers numb despite the heavy wool of your gloves, your breath a series of short, sharp clouds that were instantly torn away by the storm. Then, the sound started. It wasn't oppose, T the howl of the wind or the distant rhythmic crump of the Soviet mortars. It was a lament, a long melodic cry of a woman in deep mourning. It didn't oppose, T sound like it was coming from a specific direction. It seemed to resonate from the very air around you, a vibration that settled into the marrow of your bones. It was a sound of absolute, unadulterated grief, a funeral dirge that felt like it had been playing in this city for 1,000 years. Steiner stopped, his hand gripping a rusted pipe so hard that the metal groaned. He didn't oppose, T look at you, he was staring into the white void of the blizzard. End quote, don't oppose, T listened to the cadence, end quote, Steiner whispered, his voice a dry rasp that was barely audible over the gale. End quote, it's not a person. It's the city's playback. It's trying to sync your heartbeat to the morning. End quote. But the sound was evolving. The generic lament began to fracture into distinct familiar voices. You heard the high-pitched panic tone of Gunter calling from the dark of the grain silo. You heard the aristocratic, clipped commands of von Berg as he led the squad into the subway tunnel. The voices Warren and Oppos, T screaming in pain. They were reciting their service numbers and the names of their hometowns in a flat rhythmic chant that matched the ticking of your own frozen watch. It was the roster of the widow a vocalization of the names she had already crossed off her list. We pressed on, our movement a desperate struggle against a geography that was becoming increasingly nonsensical. We were supposed to be heading toward the 6th Army and Oppos' perimeter near the barricade, but every street we turned into seemed to lead back to the same ruined department store, its blackened storefront looking like a row of broken teeth. The Swangmu was no longer just a visual obstacle, it was a sensory prison. The smell of the bakery, the burnt flour and decay, returned with an intensity that made you gag, followed by the sterile dry scent of a funeral parlor. In the middle of a square that the maps designated as a clear zone we found them. A patrol of 10 men, their uniforms identified them as a forward element of the 24th Panzer Division. They were in Oppos, T lying in the snow, they were sitting in a perfect circle, their backs to each other, their rifles resting across their knees. They were frozen solid, their skin the color of blue-tinged marble, their eyes wide and covered in a thin layer of frost. But it was their hands that made your blood turn to ice. Every single one of them had their right arm extended, their index finger pointing toward the center of the circle. In the center of that circle of pointing dead men, the snow was undisturbed. There were no footprints, no blood, no debris. But as the wind momentarily cleared a patch of the Swangmu, you saw her. The woman in black was standing in the center of the pointing fingers. She wasn't Oppos, a solid person. She was a vertical void of absolute shadow, her black mourning veil unmoving despite the blizzard that was screaming around her. She was looking at the frozen soldiers, her posture one of quiet, predatory patience. Slowly, she turned her head toward us. You felt a coldness that bypassed the physical layers of your wool tunic and settled in your soul, a sense of being hollowed out while still alive. She didn't Oppos, have a face behind the veil, only a swirling vortex of the same gray mist that covered the Volga. She raised her hand, her movements slow and melodic, matching the rhythm of the lament that was still echoing through the ruins. She didn't Oppos, point at us. She pointed toward a small half-buried cellar door tucked beneath a heap of pulverized timber, foxhole that looked like a safe haven from the storm. The choice Steiner breathed, his voice a tremble of pure existential dread. She's offering the shortcut. She's showing us the warm corner. The lament in the air intensified, the voices of Gunter and von Berg now joined by a third voice, your own. You heard yourself calling from inside that cellar, promising a fire, food, and an end to the cold. The psychological pressure was immense, a gravity that felt like it was pulling your feet toward that door. Every instinct you possessed, every biological urge to survive the sub-zero night, was telling you to open that door and step into the dark. Turn back Steiner commanded, grabbing your shoulder with a grip that bruised the bone. Look at the direction of the wind. Look at the reality of the iron. You forced your gaze away from the cellar door, back toward the death zone of the open square where the Soviet snipers and the 152mm howitzers waited. It was a path of certain combat, of cold and steel, and the very high probability of a bullet through the brain. It was the opposite of the safe path indicated by the widow. With a roar of defiance that felt like it was tearing your throat, you turned your back on the cellar and the woman in black, and you dived into the open ruins, Steiner right beside you. Behind you, from the direction of the cellar door, there was a sound, not a scream but a long slow sigh of the city, a sound of a vacuum being filled. When you looked back over your shoulder, the cellar door was gone, buried under a sudden massive collapse of the timber above it. The safe haven was a tomb that had just been sealed. The circle of pointing panzer soldiers was swallowed by the Swangmu, their names officially transferred from the active roster to the ledger of the lost. We ran through the blizzard, our shadows flickering against the white snow like frayed ropes. The woman in black hadn't Oppos, T pursued us, but her lament was still there, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the rebar of the city. We had cheated her of 2 more names, but the night was far from over, and the blizzard was still reciting the roster. By 4 o'clock hours, the pre-dawn light of Stalingrad was nothing more than a deepening of the gray, a charcoal smudge against a horizon of frozen fire. You and Steiner had drifted into the assembly area of a shattered battalion from the 79th Infantry Division, positioned near the skeletal remains of the Red October factory. The environment here was a masterclass in industrial decay. Huge, rusted cooling towers loomed over the ruins like the monuments of a dead civilization, and the air was thick with the scent of frozen iron and the bitter, oily smoke of a city that refused to stop burning. This was H hour for a localized counteroffensive, a desperate push to seize a few hundred yards of rubble before the sunrise brought the Soviet Il-2 Sturmoviks back into the sky. You stood in a shallow trench carved into a mound of slag and frozen earth, watching the men prepare. These weren't the fresh, confident soldiers who had marched through France. These were, in quote, Frenchwain in quote, trench pigs, men whose faces were hollowed out by hunger and whose eyes were fixed in the, in quote, 1,000-yard stare, in quote. They moved with a mechanical, joyless efficiency, fixing bayonets and checking the bolts of their Carabiner 98 KS with hands that had lost all feeling. The military atmosphere was one of stifling, professional despair. Major Heinrich, a man whose uniform was as ragged as his soldiers and oppos, stood over a field table made of a discarded ammo crate, his finger tracing a route on a map that was already obsolete. End quote. We hit the gap in the Soviet line at 04:30, end quote, the major announced, his voice a dry rasp in the sub-zero air. He pointed toward a narrow breach between 2 collapsed warehouses. End quote. Intelligence suggests it's an unanchored seam in their perimeter.
We strike hard, we strike fast, and we consolidate in the basement of the administration building. Echo.
Steiner leaned against a jagged piece of rebar, his eyes scanning the ridgeline of the slag heap. He didn't oppose. Look at the major's map. He was looking at the Swang-Mu fog that was beginning to coil around the base of the cooling towers. The silence of the city had returned, that pressurized, artificial quiet that always preceded an appearance of the widow. You felt the weight of her gaze before you saw her. It was a prickling sensation at the base of your skull, a cold realization that the battlefield was no longer under the major's command. Then, she appeared. She wasn't oppose, hidden in the shadows this time. She was standing atop the highest point of the collapsed warehouse, the major's objective. In the gray pre-dawn light, she was a vertical slash of absolute obsidian. Her black mourning veil was long and heavy, cascading down the ruins like a frozen waterfall. She stood perfectly still, a silent director in a theater of pulverized brick. The wind whirled around her, kicking up sprays of white snow, but her black dress remained as solid as stone, as if she were a hole cut into the fabric of reality itself. The major didn't oppose, see her. He was too focused on his grid coordinates. But the men in the trench saw her. One by one, they stopped their preparations. The metallic click-clack of rifle bolts died away, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like it would crack the very earth. A young private next to you dropped his helmet, the steel clattering against the slag with a sound that seemed to echo for miles. End quote, Major, end quote, Steiner said, his voice a low, warning vibration. He pointed a gloved finger toward the warehouse. Heinrich looked up, his eyes narrowing as he followed Steiner's gesture. He squinted through his binoculars, the lenses reflecting the gray sky. You watched his jaw tighten. He saw her. For a moment, the professional facade of the officer cracked, and you saw the raw primal fear of a man who realized his tactical logic was being overruled by a folklore he didn't oppose, believe in.
The woman in black slowly raised her hand.
It was a melodic, agonizingly slow movement. Her finger extended, pointing not at the Soviet lines, and not at the warehouse. She pointed directly at the cellar where the major had established his command post, the very spot where you are all currently standing. Then her hand shifted, indicating a jagged suicidal path across an open field of frozen mud toward the Volga, a route that was completely exposed to Soviet machine gun fire. End quote, She's marking the spot and quote, the young private whispered, his voice cracking. And quote, she's telling us to get out.
The cellar. The cellar is the tombe point echo.
And quote, quiet. And quote, Heinrich snapped, though his own voice was trembling. And quote, it's a trick. A Soviet partisan. A psychological ploy to break our morale.
We follow the plan.
We seize the warehouse on schedule. End quote. Steiner didn't oppose, T argue. He knew the futility of trying to debate a fate that had already been pointed out. He grabbed your arm, his grip a bruising force. End quote. The direction is clear, end quote, Steiner hissed. End quote. She showed the way out. It's the open field or the grave beneath our feet.
We don't oppose. Te follow the major into the whole point echo.
The unit was divided. Some men, driven by a lifetime of military discipline and a fear of the court-martial, followed the major into the reinforced cellar to wait for the final jump-off signal. Others, the ones who had seen the widow before, began to drift away from the perimeter, their eyes wide with a frantic animal terror. You and Steiner scrambled out of the trench, moving toward the open ruins, away from the command post that the woman in black was still indicating with her frozen, dark finger. At 4:25, 5 minutes before the attack, the city Ndapos' silence was broken. It wasn't Ndapos, the sound of an infantry charge. It was the rhythmic screaming whistle of a Soviet Stalin's organ rocket battery. The barrage didn't Ndapos, hit the warehouse. It didn't Ndapos, hit the Soviet gap. The rockets, guided by a terrifying supernatural precision, slammed directly into the major's command post. The explosion was a deafening roar of fire and pulverized concrete. The cellar, the major, the map, and the 30 men who had chosen to follow orders were vaporized in a single localized eruption of violence. The ground shook with the force of a landslide, and the Swangmu was momentarily burned away by the heat of the blast.
You and Steiner lay flat against the frozen mud of the open field, the debris of the command post raining down around you like black snow.
When the smoke cleared, you looked back toward the warehouse.
The woman in black was gone.
The chimney where she had stood was empty, and the direction she had pointed was now a smoking crater. By choosing the path of the sniper and the open field, you had survived, but you were now 2 men alone in a landscape that was actively being rewritten by a mourning widow. The pre-dawn light finally broke, revealing a world of gray ruins and fresh graves. Steiner stood up, his face a mask of soot and ice. He didn't Ndapos, look at the crater. He looked at his own shadow, which was stretching across the snow toward the Volga. And she didn't Ndapos, save us and Steiner whispered. And she just moved us to the next page of the ledger. And we began to walk, 2 names still lingering on a roster that the city was determined to close. The woman in black had finished her work for the morning, but the day was long, and the Stalingrad winter was only just beginning to point its finger. The pre-dawn light of Stalingrad did not bring clarity, it only thickened the Swangmu, turning the ruins into a world of milk and charcoal. You and Steiner were moving toward the very edge of the city, where the jagged remains of the docks met the half-frozen slush of the Volga. The environment here was a sensory nightmare. Huge rusted iron cranes loomed over the riverbank like skeletal gods, their cables snapping in the sub-zero wind with the sound of a pistol shot. The air was so cold that the moisture from your eyes felt like it was freezing onto your lashes, and every breath was a localized battle against the frost. We were searching for a way to cross the frozen stretches to a rumored supply depot, but the geography of the riverbank had been warped by the shelling and the supernatural pressure of the night. We encountered a straggler near a capsized barge, a boy, no older than 19, wearing a greatcoat 3 sizes too large for his emaciated frame. He was sitting on a pile of frozen coal, staring at a small flickering lantern that shewed Ndapos, had been burning in this wind. He didn't Ndapos, look up as we approached. He was humming that same melodic, mournful lament we had heard in the library. His eyes were wide and glazed, reflecting the gray Swangmu in a way that made him look like he had already crossed the threshold into the other world. End quote. Private, report your unit, end quote. Steiner commanded, his voice a sharp professional snap that felt out of place in this cathedral of ice.
The boy, whom we had Colans, slowly raised his head.
End quote. She's waiting for the ferry, Sergeant, end quote, he whispered. End quote. She says the crossing is clear now.
No ice, no sniper. Just the long, dark water point echo.
Steiner grabbed my arm, his grip a bruising force through the wool of my tunic. He didn't oppose. Look at Hans. He was looking at the top of a rusted loading crane 30 yards ahead. There, standing on the very tip of the iron arm, was the woman in black. She was a vertical void, her mourning weeds a deeper shade of obsidian than the shadows of the docks. She was facing the Volga, her back to us, but the psychological weight of her presence was like a physical pressure against our chests. The wind was screaming through the crane's lattice, but her veil remained perfectly still, a motionless black flag in a world of chaos. Slowly, she began to turn. It wasn't oppose, a human movement. It was the world rotating around a fixed point of sorrow. As her profile emerged from the mist, she raised her hand. It was a slow, graceful arc, her gloved finger extending to point toward a small white-painted rowboat that sat pristine and untouched amidst the jagged ice of the riverbank. It was an impossible sight, a clean, undamaged boat in a city of fire and blood. End quote. There it is, end quote. Hans breathed, standing up with a sudden jerky energy.
Echo, the way home.
She's showing us the way out of the Kessel. End quote. End quote. Hans, stay back. End quote, I shouted, reaching for his collar. But the boy was already moving. He was running toward the boat, his boots making a rhythmic crunch-crunch on the frozen mud. He wasn't oppose, looking at the ice or the Soviet positions on the far bank. He was looking only at the direction the widow had pointed. He reached the edge of the water, and as he stepped into the white boat, the Swangmu swirled around him, thickening into a solid wall of white vapor. We waited for the sound of a splash, the crack of a sniper's rifle, or the roar of an anti-tank gun.
Nothing happened. Hans simply vanished into the mist.
There was no boat, no water, no boy. Just a sudden, suffocating silence that felt like the world had held its breath. End quote. She's taking the names, end quote, Steiner hissed, his voice trembling. End quote. She isn and oppose, saving them.
She's collecting the reflection point echo.
The woman in black turned her head toward us. For the first time, the veil fluttered. You didn't oppose, see a face.
You saw a vast anti-expansé of the Russian winter. A grey eternity where the sun never rose and the snow never stopped.
The end quote, curse of the pointing finger end quote, was now leveled directly at you. She wasn't oppose, pointing at a boat or a tunnel this time. She was pointing at a jagged hole in the earth, a collapsed cellar beneath the crane that looked like a dark, inviting mouth. End quote, I've had enough of this city and oppose, directions end quote, I growled. The psychological erosion of the night, the loss of Gunter, von Berg, and the Major, all of it coalesced into a single desperate moment of defiance. I didn't oppose, care about the rules of the Kessel or the hierarchy of the ghosts. I raised my Mauser, the steel of the bolt action reassuringly cold against my palm. I aimed not at the warehouse or the shadows, but directly at the obsidian void on top of the crane.
Echo, get out of our world, Echo, Herward. He fired a warning shot.
The report of the rifle was a thunderclap that shattered the artificial silence of the docks. The recoil kicked into my shoulder, a familiar grounding pain. The bullet whistled through the air, passing directly through the space where the woman in black stood. The effect was instantaneous. The moment the sound of the gunshot hit her, the woman in black didn't oppose, fall or scream. She simply dissolved. It was as if she had been made of smoke and ash, and the sound of the rifle had blown her away. The obsidian blackness vanished, replaced by the flat, gray light of the Stalingrad dawn. The Swangmu around the crane dissipated, revealing nothing but rusted iron and frozen snow. The lament that had been echoing through the ruins died mid-note, replaced by the distant rhythmic thud of the real war, the Soviet artillery returning to life. Steiner and I stood there for a long time, the smell of cordite sharp in the freezing air.
We were alone on the riverbank. The boy, the boat, and the widow were gone.
We walked slowly toward the crane, our rifles held at the ready, our eyes scanning every shadow for a sign of her return. We reached the spot directly beneath where she had stood on the iron arm. The snow there was undisturbed by the wind or the shelling. It was a pristine, white sheet. But in the very center of that space, there was a mark.
I knelt down, my torch cutting through the grey light.
It wasn't Apos, the track of a platoon or the footprint of a soldier. It was a single, solitary shoe print. It was the mark of a woman in Apos' shoe, delicate, narrow, and archaic. But what made my blood turn to ice was the state of the mud inside the print. Despite the sub-zero temperature and the driving snow, the mud inside that single footprint was bone-dry and cracked, as if a localized fire had instantly evaporated every drop of moisture from the earth. There was only one. No trail leading to it, no trail leading away. Just a single, dry mark of where the sorrow of the city had momentarily touched the ground. And quote, she left a receipt and quote, Steiner whispered, his voice a dry rasp. We didn't endopose. Stay to investigate. We turned and walked back toward the interior of the ruins, away from the Volga and the silence of the docks. We were two men still carrying our shadows, still holding onto our names in a city that wanted to borrow them forever. The woman in black was gone for now, but the roster was still open, and the Stalingrad winter was far from over. The final night of the Stalingrad Kessel was not a night of fire and thunder, but a night of absolute suffocating darkness. By late January 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to be a fighting force and had become a collection of starving ghosts huddled in the sublevels of a city that had already forgotten them. You and Steiner were trapped in the deepest basement of the Univermag department store, the site of the final German command post. The air here was a stagnant frozen soup of unwashed bodies, gangrene, and the earthy bitter scent of the Volga and Apos' mud. The silence of the city had reached its terminal stage. It was no longer a pause in the war, but the sound of the world ending. There was no radio chatter, no orders, only the rhythmic wet gasps of men who were waiting for the silence to claim them. Steiner sat across from you, his back against a weeping concrete wall. In the dim flickering light of a single tallow candle, he looked less like a soldier and more like a sketch in charcoal. His eyes were wide and fixed, reflecting a light that shewed Ndapos, have been there. He had Ndapos, spoken since we entered the sublevels, but his hands were constantly moving, tracing invisible grid coordinates on the dirt floor. He was no longer looking for a way out of the city. He was looking for the woman in black, she was no longer a figure on a ruin to him, she had become the architecture of his mind. At 3 o'clock hours, the environment of the basement shifted. The swung mu fog didn't oppose, seep in through the ventilation shafts this time. It seemed to manifest directly from the shadows in the corner. The temperature dropped so sharply that the tallow candle sputtered and died, plunging us into a darkness so thick it felt like being buried alive. In that absolute blackness, the sound started, the melodic, mournful lament of the widow. It wasn't Ndapos, a whisper anymore, it was a physical vibration that shook the concrete floor. Then, the silence returned, and with it, the presence. I felt the curse of the pointing finger before I saw it. It was a cold directional pressure, like a magnetic pull toward the far wall of the basement, a wall of solid reinforced concrete that led nowhere. I reached for my torch, my hand shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. I flicked the switch. The beam of light was weak and yellow, cutting through the swirling swangmu like a rusted knife. She was there. The woman in black was standing in the center of the room, barely 3 yards away. This was the clearest confrontation we had ever had. She wasn't Ndapos, a silhouette or a blur, she was a physical subtraction from reality. Her black mourning weeds were so dark they looked like they were made of the very space between stars. The veil was long and heavy, hiding whatever lay beneath it, but you could feel the weight of her gaze through the fabric. She stood perfectly still, her back to the only exit. Slowly, she raised her hand. The movement was so deliberate, so rhythmic, that it felt like it took hours. Her gloved finger extended, pointing directly at Steiner. Then her hand shifted, indicating a crack in the concrete wall behind him, a crack that was no wider than a handspan. To any rational mind, it was a dead end. But in the logic of the Stalingrad widow, it was a doorway. Steiner didn't endopose, hesitate. He stood up with a sudden jerky energy, his face a mask of utter vacancy. He wasn't endopose, afraid anymore. He was a man who had finally been given a direction in a world of chaos. He began to walk toward the crack in the wall, his boots making no sound on the dirt floor. And quote, Steiner, turn back. And quote, I roared, my voice sounding thin and metallic in the dead air. I lunged forward to grab his webbing, but my hand passed through him as if he were made of smoke. Steiner didn't endopose, even look back. He walked directly into the crack. For a second, his shadow was cast against the concrete by my torch, a long distorted silhouette that looked like it was being pulled into the stone. Then he was gone. He didn't endopose, scream, he didn't endopose, struggle. He simply dissolved into the architecture of the city. The woman in black turned her head toward me. For the first time, she raised her other hand and pulled back the veil. I didn't endopose, see a face. I saw the entire history of the siege, every frozen body, every burnt letter, every tear shed on the banks of the Volga. It was a vortex of sorrow that threatened to pull my very soul out of my chest. She raised her finger and pointed it directly at me. Then she pointed at the heavy steel door that led back to the surface, back to the real war where the Soviet troops were already entering the building. The choice was absolute: follow Steiner into the silence of the city, or follow the widow's finger back into the hell of the living. I chose to live. I turned my back on the void and dived for the steel door. As I pushed through, I felt a coldness behind me, a long slow sigh of the basement being reclaimed by the dark. When I reached the surface, the Swangmu was gone. The sun was rising over a city of white snow and black ruins. The Sixth Army was finished. I was one of the few who were taken prisoner. As we were marched toward the camps, I looked back at the ruins of the department store. On the very top of the jagged roof, a smudge of blackness was visible against the gray sky. She wasn't endopose, pointing anymore. She was just watching the column of men, checking the names off her list. I never saw Steiner again. He wasn't endopose, on the casualty lists, and he wasn't endopose, in the camps. He had followed the finger into the only part of Stalingrad that was still standing, the memory of its grief. The siege of Stalingrad ended in February 1943, leaving behind a graveyard that stretched for miles. But for those of us who survived the sublevels of the Univermag, the war didn't endopose, end with a surrender. We carried the woman in black with us, a silent passenger in our nightmares. Even years later, in the safety of a quiet home, I sometimes find myself looking at a dark corner or a shadow on the wall. I wonder if the city is still calling the roster.
I wonder if Steiner is still walking through concrete, looking for a way out.
This is the report that was never filed. It is a document of a reality that exists only in the gaps between the artillery shells and the headlines. The Lady of Sorrows is still there, standing on the ruins of every place that has seen too much pain. She doesn't endopose, speak, she doesn't endopose, judge, she only points. Tonight, the smoke pit is growing cold, and the fire is dying down. We have returned from the frozen banks of the Volga, but the silence remains. I have shared my report. Now I ask you, the ones who have walked the perimeter in the dark, have you ever seen her? Have you ever felt a finger pointing you toward a path that shouldn't endopose, exist? The night is long, and the roster is never truly closed. Would you like me to open another forgotten document from the tunnels of the Maginot Line in 1940, or perhaps the haunted forests of the Ardennes during the winter of Andapos. 44.